Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Nick Parker. I recently finished up my master's at K-State, and I'll be sharing a little bit of my research there, focused on lesser prairie chicken response to megafire in Kansas. So to start off, a little bit of background on lesser prairie chickens and fire. As I'm sure many of you know, lesser prairie chickens are an iconic grassland grouse species of the Southern Great Plains, primarily threatened by habitat loss and land use change. The native prairies have been converted for agriculture, energy development, and just other anthropogenic development in general. They're also threatened by changes to drivers in these systems. In grasslands, fire has long been excluded following European settlement. Fire was really important for lesser prairie chickens. First and foremost, it maintained a treeless landscape. Lesser prairie chickens are very sensitive to tall features on the landscape. So the growing wood encroachment problem we're having in the Great Plains basically has resulted in a large loss of habitat as well as fragmentation for lesser prairie chickens. Fire was also important at maintaining a heterogeneous landscape for lesser prairie chickens, along with grazing and climatic factors such as drought. Basically, what I mean by heterogeneous is just, within grasslands, different areas of thicker, taller grass that maybe haven't been burned or grazed recently that provide good nesting or adult cover, and areas that have been burned more recently. They're a little bit more open, have more forbs that can provide, lekking habitat or habitat for raising young. And so we've seen the beneficial effects from returning this small scale fire for lesser prairie chickens. However, in most of the lesser prairie chicken range in Western Kansas, we don't see a lot of prescribed fire. Obviously, you can see the Flint Hills here where we see a lot of fire, but in Western Kansas, most of the fire we have is in the form of wildfire. And those fires have been increasing in size and severity. So the Anderson Creek fire was the largest fire in Kansas in 2016 until the Starbuck fire burned about 254,000 hectares in 2017, becoming the largest fire in Kansas history. And both of these are what we call megafires, which are basically just really, really big fires, usually greater than 100,000 acres. And they often have a very large social and economic impact. You can see from these images from the Starbuck fire, about 9,000 cattle died, $40 to $50 million in damage, at least one person died. These are big catastrophic events. And so these are increasing worldwide across the Great Plains as a result of climate change. And so within the lesser prairie chicken range, they're increasing as well. And we don't really know how lesser prairie chickens respond to events of this kind, of this size. So that was our question. How does megafire impact lesser prairie chickens? We know that small scale fire is important for lesser prairie chickens, but how do they respond to something of this magnitude? So we hypothesized that, burning 600,000 acres of grassland is going to result in limited habitat and limited resources for lesser prairie chickens post-fire. As a result, we're going to see reduced Lek attendance. And so we usually use Lek attendance as sort of a population index. So if we're seeing a lot less lesser prairie chickens on the landscape, we're going to see, basically a decrease in the population. We also hypothesized that we would see a decrease in lesser prairie chicken survival after the fire because, again, limited habitat, limited cover, more susceptible to predation, more extreme thermal environments, that sort of stuff. And then finally, space use. With limited habitat, limited resources, these birds might have to travel further to obtain the resources they need. And so that in turn might also result in reduced survival and reduced Lek attendance. So we conducted the study in Western Kansas. You can see the lesser prairie chicken range there in dark gray, and those two big fires I talked about. But we're going to be focusing in on the Starbuck fire there in the bright red, and we conducted our study in those purple areas there in Clark County. And so we had a pretty unique opportunity here in that we had pre-fire data on this lesser prairie chicken population from 2014 to 2016. They were able to return after the fire from 2018 to 2020, sort of get a sense of what happened to these lesser prairie chickens. So we conducted Lek surveys in both spring and fall, basically just going out there, counting the number of males on Leks. And then we related that to the vegetation landscape characteristics surrounding about a 5-kilometer radius of those Leks based on some previous work that had been done. So to try and get out what areas the lesser prairie chickens are using and where we're seeing the population shift to or maybe not shift to after the fire. Looking at survival and space use, before and after the fire, we captured lesser prairie chickens on Leks using drop nets, walk-in traps, and then outfitted them with either VHF or satellite backpack transmitters. And then we monitored those birds to estimate their survival and space use. So for survival, we used known fate models in R, and we estimated survival in first the breeding season. So from March to September, that kind of incorporates the time of their lekking, nesting, raising young. This is usually the time when they're most active, and so they have usually lower survival. And then we looked at survival in the non-breeding season, sort of encompassing the fall and winter months when they're a little bit less active. And then to look at home ranges, we calculated 95% home ranges using Brownian bridge movement models. And we did that in both breeding seasons as well, and then compared before and after the fire. And then we also calculated percent cover within those home ranges to see kind of what these lesser prairie chickens are using. And so we looked at cover of native working grassland, which is, grasslands managed for cattle production in this region, which is the dominant land use in this area. And then we looked at another category of grassland, which is the Conservation and Reserve Program, or CRP. So former crop fields planted with usually native grass species. And we looked at cropland and other. So jumping straight into results, looking at Lek attendance, before the fire, we're seeing about 140 to 150 males on about 12 leks before the fire. After the fire, we saw about a 67% decrease. And we haven't really seen those numbers bounce back. Now we're only seeing about 30 males across all those leks. So there's just a large reduction in the population in this area as a result of this fire. Looking at Lek attendance, again, and seeing sort of what influenced that, we found crop best predicted Lek attendance before and after the fire. So on this graph, we have male attendance on the Lek on the y-axis and the proportion of crop on the x-axis. And before the fire, in that black line there, you can see basically what we normally expect from lesser prairie chicken populations. We see the most lesser prairie chickens on leks in areas with very little crop, or they prefer, grassland dominated areas. After the fire, we're seeing the exact opposite, where we're seeing more lesser prairie chickens in these areas of greater cropland cover, which is pretty surprising because, you wouldn't normally expect to see lesser prairie chickens in one of those areas. But a big part of that is many of those cropland fields didn't burn in the fire. So they kind of provided a little bit of buffer maybe for these leks. And so we see less prairie chickens moving to these unburned areas, sort of protected by those crop fields. Looking at adult survival, we didn't see any difference in adult survival in either the breeding or non-breeding season. Again, pretty surprising. But basically, an adult lesser prairie chicken has about the same chance of surviving after the fire as they did before the fire. And looking at home range size, we actually saw a similar trend as well. No difference in breeding size, breeding home range size, and same for the non-breeding season. So again, no change in home range size. So they have about the same chance of surviving, and they're using about the same area. However, when we look at home range composition, we do start to see a few differences. As you can see, grassland, or those native working grassland, as I talked about, is predominantly what they're using in this area. But after the fire, we do see them using an increasing amount of CRP, about a 5 times increase after the fire. And again, this comes back to those, being former crop fields. And so many of those CRP grass fields are still kind of in a matrix of cropland. So protected from the fire, didn't burn. So they provide, high quality habitat for these lesser prairie chickens after the fire. However, they weren't really using those areas before, but after the fire, we see them moving into those areas a lot more. So to kind of bring this back to our hypothesis and sort of summarize, we did see a big decrease in Lek attendance, indicating this megafire did impact lesser prairie chicken populations in the area. But we didn't see any effect to lesser prairie chicken survival or space use. However, we did, while they weren't using more space, they did shift where they were, again, utilizing more CRP than the native working grasslands they preferred before the fire. So to conclude, the 600,000 acre wildfire did result in negative consequences for the lesser prairie chicken population, as they, we saw a big reduction in the population, and they're avoiding what we would call, formerly high quality grasslands, kind of moving into these sort of fragmented areas we don't usually see them using. However, while there were negative consequences, it is pretty surprising that they have managed to hang on in this area at all, maintain that high survival. And a big part of that is that those large areas of native working grasslands that had a strong population before the fire, and then those areas of sort of CRP cropland sort of matrix there that provided some refuge and habitat after the fire. So moving forward, it's important to consider the importance of CRP when managing for lesser prairie chickens. So following future megafires, we might have to think about minimizing haying or grazing of those CRP patches in areas where there are lesser prairie chickens, to maybe conserve some habitat for them following megafire. And also just the importance of fire in general. While this large fire was bad for lesser prairie chickens, returning small scale, patch burn grazing, prescribed burning can use to manage habitat for lesser prairie chickens, strengthen their populations, and also reduce fuels on the landscape to prevent future megafires. And with that, I want to thank all of our landowners, all of our technicians, all of our partners at K-State, Kansas Wildlife and Parks that made this project possible. And thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, please comment below or feel free to send me an email. And look forward to your questions. Thank you.